Welcome everybody. I'm sure nearly everyone has joined us before, and this is coming up to well over 300 Zoom events that AJR have run over the last year. We're delighted to have with us this evening Simon May, who is the author of How to Be a Refugee. I'm going to pop a link on chat which will take you to where you can purchase the book if you haven't had an opportunity to read the book yet. Simon's book is the gripping account of the story of three sisters, and he will be in conversation with David Herman, who is the guest editor of the AJR Journal and who I am sure many of you have heard speak before. We are recording this evening's event and it will appear on AJR's YouTube channel. Although Simon and David are spotlighted, if you don't want to appear in any of the recording, please switch your video off. Everyone is locked on mute as normal, and we will be taking questions through the chat facility at the bottom of the page, where I will also put the link to the book. So welcome, enjoy yourselves this evening. Thank you to David and Simon for joining us, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you so much, Susan. Welcome, everybody. Simon was born in London, the son of a German Jewish violinist and a German Jewish brush manufacturer, about whom we'll hear a lot more. He's visiting professor of philosophy at King's College London, and his books include Love, A New Understanding of an Ancient Emotion, Love, A History, Nietzsche's Ethics and His War on Morality, The Power of Cute, and Thinking Aloud. And Simon's just brought out his latest book, an extraordinary family memoir called How to Be a Refugee, published by Picador. And Simon's going to just speak about the book for 5 to 6 minutes or so, and then I will ask him questions about the book, and then we will hand over to you all for your questions for the last 10 or 15 minutes or so. So Simon, if you'd like to start about your book.
Great, thank you, David. Well, I'm very happy to be here. The three letters AJR evoke for me a whole world, my parents' world and the world of their friends, nearly all of whom were refugees from Nazism. My father died when I was, so I remember little of him, but my mother read the AJR Journal religiously. She'd always have the latest issue behind her bed, often passing it to me with articles marked for my attention, full of exclamation marks and thick underlining in black ink. That the AJR was so important to her as a focus of belonging is itself paradoxical, because my mother and her sisters, and this is a central theme of my book, were themselves conflicted about their Jewish heritage to the point where she sometimes and her sisters almost always denied or repudiated it altogether. In fact, the focus of this book is precisely on a remarkably unknown side to Jewish life in Hitler's Germany, and actually long before 1933, namely refusal of your Jewish origin to the point where you manage to erase almost all consciousness of being Jewish. It's hard to express because it's an inner sort of question, so to speak, of the soul. But in reaction to a long history of racial and religious persecution, but also, and maybe even more so, out of intense love for German culture, you somehow purge your soul of this heritage and erase its cultural memory until it just seems to have nothing to do with you. In other words, this inner purging in my mother's family, though absolutely not in my father's, went much, much further than the famous assimilation of many middle-class German Jews. I mean, those Jews who thought of themselves as German first and Jewish second, and who continued to read Goethe and Schiller and so on, even as Hitler's persecution worsened, but whose love of German culture never caused them to stop thinking of themselves as Jewish. In my mother's family, things were very different. She and both her sisters converted to Catholicism during the 1930s, after Hitler's rise to power. One of my aunts, Ursel, who was then a young actress in Berlin and who had been expelled from her first job in 1935 and spent years in hiding, somehow wangled official acceptance as an Aryan as late as 1941. You could imagine what was already building up then, with the crucial help of Hans Hinkel, the powerful deputy of Goebbels. And as General Secretary of the Reichskulturkammer, which was in charge of overseeing all culture in the German Reich, SS officer and State Secretary Hinkel was incredibly the very person who Goebbels had placed in charge of purging German cultural life of all Jews. And yet he, as I know from my aunt, but also have found corroboration in the German archives, he ensured that she got a certificate of Aryan belonging. And after receiving that, Ursel went on to marry into the high German aristocracy. Incredibly, in the year 1943, we all know what was happening then, and even returned to the job in the theatre from which she'd been evicted in 1935. But her false identity didn't actually succeed for long. Just after she became a Countess of the Reich, Reichsgräfin, her cover was blown and the Gestapo came after her. She then fled to Holland, and with the help of the Dutch underground, she hid there for the rest of the war. Meanwhile, my other aunt, Ilse, was in Berlin, engaged equally incredibly to a card-carrying Nazi who was an up-and-coming composer of film music. He was a young man who'd already written the soundtrack to a number of popular movies, such as Kleiner Mann, was nun, the text of which was the novel by his friend Hans Fallada, who's recently been rediscovered as a writer. And together, he and my aunt Ilse, Babelsberg in the evenings, the Hollywood of Germany, which was of course infested with Nazis at that time. And she lived with brazen impunity in the capital of the Third Reich without anyone ever threatening her. Indeed, by night, she was hiding Jews in cellars at huge risk to herself. As I repeatedly emphasize in the book, to recount these incredible contortions of ethnic and cultural concealment is absolutely categorically not to criticize them. I mean, who are we, or those of us who've never experienced racial hatred in its vehement forms, to criticize anyone's strategy to survive in such conditions? I felt the right to write this book only because my family's choices are, in a sense, also my business, because to be born into this strange tributary of the Jewish experience was to be commanded to construct an identity out of everything that I was not. So following the death of my father, who, as David said, was also a German Jewish refugee, I was raised a Catholic, indeed even became an altar boy at one stage. I was forbidden most of the time, but not always, to identify as Jewish. The laws of that never became clear to me. And I was definitely forbidden to speak German or to think of myself as German in any contemporary sense. Above all, perhaps, I was forbidden to think of myself as British. In other words, I was allowed to be none of the things that I actually was. So what identity did this leave? In effect, the only permitted identity was to live in a pre-war world of German culture that no longer existed. And this, of course, was true for my brother as well, who I haven't mentioned so far. A world which our mother never really accepted had been lost. And so I was mandated, on pain of betraying her, a word that was often used, to think of myself as a refugee in the country of my own birth, though of course I'd never fled from anywhere or to anywhere. And I grew up with a sense of being a sort of hereditary refugee, if you like. And of course, one cannot live in that's disappeared. It's just not possible. So let's say that the heritage was pretty challenging. Nonetheless, it's a heritage for which I'm profoundly grateful, because it gave, I felt, me huge riches, as well as enormous incentive to seek and build a world and a life of my own, something which I think for every one of us is always still a work in progress. So I think I'll stop there. I mean, there's a lot more to the book, for example, about the limits of restitution, you know, why we need to search this crazy search for an identity anyway, and so on. But I think that will suffice for now.
Thank you, Simon. There's obviously a huge amount of detail to unpack, but also sort of big questions about identity loss and belonging and so on. I just wanted to start with a sense which you provide very beautifully in the book of the background in Berlin, the home that your mother and aunts grew up in. So can you just tell us a little bit about that home?
Sure. Well, I mean, to those in the audience who come from that background or who are the descendants of that background, it will be very familiar. It was a very cultured home, profoundly devoted to German culture, in particular music, but also, you know, as was almost cliched, literature and, you know, philosophy. Goethe, Schopenhauer were, according to my mother, often read out loud after dinner. My grandmother would go to the piano and accompany herself singing Lieder. Musicians would arrive to visit, including the well-known Russian cellist Gregor Piatigorsky, who was living in Berlin at that time and who was actually responsible for my mother becoming a violinist. The odd thing is that the downstairs neighbors of my grandparents were Baron and Baroness Schlittenbach. My mother never stopped talking about the Schlittenbachs. And the Schlittenbachs used to stage, you know, these Berlin flats were huge. I mean, there were 12-room flats, and they actually had converted about half their flat into a little opera house. And they had a stage and curtains, and they would have well-known singers from the Staatsoper or the what was then called the Städtische Oper, which I think is now sort of what the Deutsche Oper is, the second opera house. And you know, and they would also have chamber music concerts, and that's where Piatigorsky often played with his trio and with others. And he would call apartment and off change into his white tie and so on. So there were a lot of musicians who came by, and it was a house of great culture. They celebrated Christmas, as many German Jews did, the complete works, you know, with a Christmas tree and O Tannenbaum and all the songs, and Weihnachtsgebäck and Goose and the cook and her colleagues. There was, you know, they had staff, though they weren't any. I mean, my grandfather was a lawyer at the Kammergericht in Berlin, which he wasn't particularly wealthy, but I think it was quite common to have staff in those days, and they would wheel in the goose. My mother always described this, how the Christmas took place. And the three daughters would all have a table on which their presents were arranged, and precisely 7 o'clock on the 24th, which is when Germans celebrate Christmas, my grandfather would ring a bell. My mother spoke about this literally until the day she died. It meant so much to her. And he would ring a bell, and the three daughters would rush into this room, and they would each tear the cloth off their table, so to speak, and there would be great excitement. And the upstairs neighbor was the grandmother of Walter Benjamin, the writer. I mean, she died, and then a relative of hers came in. And my mother remembered rather, you know, Walter Benjamin climbing up those creaking stairs to his flat when she was very young. And of course, she had no idea who he was, but in terms of a writer. But, you know, that was the scene. And I think the other thing I should mention, again, which was very common among those kinds of bourgeois German Jews, was a sense of intense solidity. In fact, that was one of the family words that I always heard repeated. Das ist alles so solide. Everything is so solid, which meant they felt they had achieved a world of security that would just
One reason
continue.
why they felt this was because your grandfather had already converted to Christianity back in
True.
1910.
He had converted, but I don't think that was the prime. He had converted, I think, really just tactically. I don't think there was any conviction in it. Whereas there was, when my mother went on to convert to Catholicism, that was really, as I understand it, a matter of profound conviction for reasons that I could go into, you might want to, but that are, I think, complicated. But my grandfather converted many German Jews, had converted already since the early 19th century. You know, Karl Marx was converted, and Heine was converted, and Gustav Mahler converted, and Schoenberg converted, and Klemperer converted. I mean, it went on and on and on. So a lot of that was tactical. And I'm not sure, he came from a family of very poor traders in West Prussia, it's now Poland. And he made his way up to the Kammergericht, which is still existing, by the way. It's Germany's oldest court. It still exists in exactly the location where he went to work. And I think he needed to convert in order to achieve that. I think the sense of solidity wasn't due to the conversion. It was something that, I don't know, you know, it was a mixture of reality. I mean, don't forget, Germany had emancipated. You know, the Edict of Emancipation was in 1812. And in many ways, Germany was ahead of other European countries in emancipating the Jews. And when Bismarck came to power, who was my grandfather's great hero, political hero, you know, he allowed, I mean, he really, at least formally speaking, there was equality for Jews throughout the German Reich, which he unified in 1871. So there was a sense that things were just getting better and better. They were advancing in all areas of German life. 50% of the lawyers in Berlin were Jewish, 50%. I can't remember exactly what the percentage of Jews in Berlin was, but it probably wasn't higher than 0.5% or 1%. And that, I mean, maybe less. So, you know, that's a huge number. So there was a sense of, listen, if this is, you know, possible, then we're okay. And
But then in 1933, something terrible and really quite shocking happens to your grandfather.
Yes, I mean, not shocking in the sense that it happened, you know, uniquely to him or even earlier to him than to others. But yes, I mean, already in April of 33, because he worked for a court, he was really, in a sense, employed by the state. And of course, the law for I can't remember the exact words now, but, you know, for the purification, some ghastly term of the German civil service came in, where Jews were systematically expelled. And, you know, you could be converted to 100 times. It didn't help you. And yes, I mean, my mother repeated this story in horror literally until the day before she died. She never got over it, ever. And I used to try to beg her to, because, you know, I don't know, it was kind of a bit much to hear it as often as I did. There was nothing I could do about it, but she's terribly, terribly hurt. And basically, he arrived at the court. I mean, he knew about the edict, but somehow he thought, you know, it'll take time till it's implemented, or there'll be a letter to inform me or something. But he did not expect the welcome he received from his own clerk. He arrived at the court, according to, well, my mother, of course, saw him that very day because he came straight home and told the story. And he arrived at the court, and he walked, his offices were not on the second floor or something. He walked upstairs, he entered the offices, and his clerk was standing there, who was normally very deferential in the way that you were in those days in Germany, and you sitzen only and so on. And he said, he uttered terrible words to him. He said, "Hau hier sofort ab, du ostasiatischer Affe," which means get out of here immediately, you East Asian monkey, using the address du, which would have been obviously an unthinkable way of addressing any colleague, let alone a superior. And he then hurled him down the stairs. And my grandfather, of course, was devastated, but he actually, apparently, he didn't give up. He went back upstairs and thought, well, look, I'll talk to senior lawyer. You know, who does my clerk think he is? I mean, you know, someone here will see sense. So he went in, and before he had a chance, the clerk threw him back down the stairs. I mean, he must have been terribly injured. Anyway, he went home, and you know, it was a terrible business. And but he still believed, and that's unbelievable to me, that Hitler wouldn't succeed. I mean, again, there's nothing unusual in that. Many of them didn't. But you know, after you've experienced that, you'd think this is pretty real, or at least you'd think, I'm out of here. He never contemplated emigration. He was too German. He didn't want to. He believed in Germany. That's the insane thing, you know. But I mean, again, that story is not original. I mean, he believed that the German people and the people around Hitler would see sense, and that pragmatism would prevail. I mean, after all, if 50% of the lawyers in the capital of the Reich are Jewish, and you throw them all out, then, you know, people can't divorce each other, they can't conclude contracts, and so on. And among them will be some Nazis with influence who also want to divorce their spouses and, you know, buy their homes or sell their homes and so on. So, and in fact, my grandfather worked in the family law division, so he was very much concerned with divorces. And, you know, divorce was very common in Berlin already. It was very advanced in that sense. So he just believed pragmatism would prevail. And he was unfortunately confirmed in his, sorry?
He never really recovers. I mean, he dies before the end of the year.
Well, he does, but he was unfortunately, and my mother sort of thought, well, maybe he would have emigrated if that hadn't happened. He was actually invited back after a few weeks to the court for precisely the reason that they couldn't conclude cases if they lost so many of their lawyers. And he thought, aha, you know, I'm right. Pragmatism will prevail. And, you know, of course, when they needed him again, they were politer. So he returned. And also, I describe in the book, you know, many of his friends who had either also been thrown out of work or in fact, one friend who was the father of my mother's closest friend, she was called Louisa Borchardt, and her father was a very famous neurosurgeon called Moritz Borchardt, who had actually, he'd operated on Lenin and he'd operated on Karl Löber, who was the president of the Bundestag, of the Reichstag, and he was a top neurosurgeon in Berlin, a real innovator. And he had actually coincidentally retired just a couple of weeks before Hitler came to power. I mean, he just reached the age of 65, so he had retired to great fanfare, as he was a celebrated man, despite the anti-Semitic frenzy in the air outside. And he was called out of retirement. He didn't even want to be, but he was called out of retirement, you know, again, because so many surgeons in Berlin were Jewish and they'd lost a lot of people. So he was called out of retirement. And, you know, my grandfather saw this. He saw also his friends going back to work. So he thought, oh, you know, it'll be okay in the end. Then he was thrown out yet again. And that was really it. I mean, he just, you know, he couldn't take it. I mean, there was no social security, obviously. You know, he had 3 daughters to take care of, a fairly young wife still. And he just got a heart attack one day and died from the stress. So it was a horrible story, terrible story.
One of the things that struck me more rereading the book than the first time I read it was that this left a very female family, because there was the grandmother,
yes,
the mother, and 3 daughters.
Yes.
And really, as you go through the book, it is very, and indeed the world you then grew up in, but for reasons we'll come to later, was also a very female family.
Correct. Well, I mean, I grew up in a largely female world. I mean, in terms of the older generation, because of course, you know, my mother was widowed very young, and though I have no idea whether she had any other men in her life. If she did, it was very discreet. All her friends, like Louisa Borchardt, wonderful, who became my godmother, were women. So I only grew up in the company of mainly German Jewish women, or Austrian Jewish women, and I mean that was fine. I mean, the funny thing was, this sounds like a politically correct thing to say these days, but it's not. I felt much more comfortable in the company of women just because I knew them in a way I didn't know men. And though there were, on my father's side, there was an uncle. I mean, I had an uncle, his brother, because of you know what families are like, a long and complicated thing that preceded my birth. We never saw him, though he lived in London. I only met him once, and I loved him. He was obviously a rascal, and I remember him driving me. He lived near Marble Arch. He drove me in his Jaguar down Park Lane and back up again at 70 miles an hour or something. I mean, today you'd have 100 speed cameras would fine you for that. But he was a great character. I just remember from that one meeting with him. It was after my father died. But so there was one male relative in London, but I never met him. I then also had two half-brothers, but I never met them either for the same kinds of reasons. Family, Monsieur Gus.
So going back to Berlin, 1933, there's your grandmother, your mother, your their mother, your two aunts.
Yeah.
And they become Catholics. They don't just become Christians, they become really
Correct.
about. Why do they become Catholics?
Well, that's something that, I've been, I think a lot of us, I mean, I have a number, of course, of friends in my situation who also have two German or Austrian or Czech, German Jewish parents. And we're all fascinated about our background. I mean, inevitably, because so I was, Ausfragen, I was cross-questioning my mother and her two sisters and anybody who I could ask from a very young age, just to understand this strange background. And I asked this question many times. Why did you do it? And I never really got it. I suppose it's often difficult to know why one does something. Well, it was the most wonderful thing that I discovered that I could possibly discover. And, it's the right religion. And it was often justified as updated Judaism, which is not the first time it happened. Funnily enough, I was reading not long ago something by Spinoza, who lived in the 17th century, who almost converted to Catholicism. Again, regarding it as, after all, it's rooted in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scriptures. It's very much the product of Paul, a converted Jew. I mean, it's not a million miles away, but of course it's incredibly different in spirit and in doctrine. Look, I have my own explanation for it, but I was never given one. And my own explanation is twofold. One is that unlike German Lutheranism, which was the common thing to convert to if you were in North Germany, it wasn't a national religion. I mean, German Lutheranism was German. And at a time when when Jews were no longer accepted as Germans, increasingly were not accepted as Germans, and finally stripped of, any sense of belonging. This was an international religion with headquarters in Rome, outside Germany, which was it was better as a hiding place or as a place in which you might feel some security. I think the other thing about Catholicism is that, it has this very pagan element with the worship of relics and saints, and it has a sort of Rococo element that the starkness of Protestantism doesn't have. And I think that emotional effusiveness also provided a kind of home. But that's really just speculation on my part. Both those reasons. I can't give any other reason.
And your mother is the first to leave. She leaves Germany and she comes to Britain.
my mother leaves Germany. My mother was actually, she was ambivalent about being Jewish, but in the end, that's what she went for. And I remember the conversation when she was very old, and I said to her, look, I've got to speak about this. We're all going to die. You have three choices. Where do you want to be buried? It's either the secular graveyard, or it's a Catholic graveyard, or it's a Jewish graveyard. And without missing a beat, she said the Jewish graveyard. I was astonished. But so my mother came to England. Said she was determined to leave. That was completely unacceptable. But she wanted to go to France. Mercifully, she didn't. She was very Francophile, always. But she had started studying with a well-known violin teacher called Max Vostal, who was, I think at 25 already, he was a professor at the Hochschule in Berlin. And he was going to London. I think he had connections here. So she followed him to London and didn't go to Paris, thank God. And then she was part of a class that included the three non-cello members of the Amadeus String Quartet, and lots of others were, there are lots of photos of all of them together in Hampstead, in Rostal's garden. And so she really came to London because of Rostal. Funnily enough, just before the end of last year, after I'd finished this book, I got a call from the head of an archive in Berlin saying, I'm the archivist of Max Rostal and Leo Rostal, his brother, who was a cellist. I just want to know, are you the grandson of Ernst Liedtke? So I said, yes, I certainly am. And they said, well, we found you through the University of Hamburg that had this project on German Jews and so on. And they said, we've found in the archive of Max Rostal a letter from your grandmother to Rostal after, from your grandfather to Rostal, begging him to take his daughter, my mother, to London, and saying, this was after he'd been thrown out of work, and saying, dear Mr. Rostal, you will understand, being in the same position, by which he meant you as a fellow Jew have been sacked, which of course he was sacked from the Hochschule, that I cannot afford to pay for any lessons anymore. So please, can you teach my daughter for nothing? And this letter just surfaced, literally a few weeks ago. And I was very, very moved by it. It was a long letter in which he just begged him to take my mother to London and as I say, not to charge, which he did. He never charged a penny. So that's why she came to London.
But her story, there's still a few more twists and turns before we get onto the aunts, because she changes her name, she changes her nationality. It's not quite as simple as that she just ups and goes to London.
No. Well, she changed her name for purely pragmatic reasons, because when you came here, you were not allowed to work. She was like all of them. She was stateless. Her German passport expired in 1937, I think it was. It just expired, like our passports, every 10 years they expire. And she went to the German consulate in London to try to get it renewed. And of course, she had to then produce birth certificates of her parents, proof of ethnic origin, and she knew what that meant. So she basically said, look, you damn well just renew this and stop asking such stupid questions. Well, he didn't. And so she left the passport there at the embassy. She always described that with a big chuckle. She just slapped it down and said, you can have the passport back, goodbye. Left and was stateless for 10 years. So she was naturalized in 1947. Now, you also weren't allowed to work. You weren't officially allowed to earn money. I don't know how the British authorities thought people would live, but obviously they all earned money. She earned money by giving people, amateurs, violin lessons for cash. But then she had a big break, because in 1940, the Czech government, which was then in exile in London after Hitler invaded the Sudetenland, the ambassador to London, who later became foreign minister, who was a man called Jan Masaryk. Masaryk some discovered her. I mean, I won't go through it, it's too long and detailed how that happened, but I know how that happened. But it happened actually through anyway, it doesn't matter now how it happened. So she basically, she was invited by Masaryk to join a trio called the Czech Trio, which had emigrated from Prague, and the pianist was someone called Walter Suskind, who later went on to the States, and the cellist was called Karel Horschitz, who was urgently persuaded to change his surname to Karel Horitz because of how it sounded in English. And my mother was told that she needed also to change her name because Marianne Liedtke, which was her real name, sounded unbearably German. And, you know, that wasn't something that the Czechs particularly wanted after their country had been invaded. So she came up with the idea, she found out that she had an ancestor who had come from Bohemia, which was German at the time, but his name was Duchke. So she said, I'm going to change my name to a Czech name, at least it's currently. And Masaryk said, that's quite impossible. I mean, you can't be called Duchke if you want to not sound German. The name sounds like an occupation. So he came up with the idea of Liedtke, which is actually a Czech, the diminutive, I think, of Ludmila or something like that in Czech. And he said, don't call yourself Mariana, call yourself Maria. So she became Maria Liedtke. But that was for purely pragmatic reasons in order to look like a Czech.
Okay, so she is in London with a Czech name and a Czech identity. Your aunt Ilse, however,
yes,
she doesn't go anywhere. She just stays in Germany.
I don't know how Ilse did it. I mean, it's remarkable because she always told me, I mean, again, I was so fascinated by this whole history. I used to ask her from childhood onwards. She always said to me she wasn't frightened through the whole Third Reich. You know, I don't know whether that's a question of profound repression or what.
So she stays in Germany for the entire time.
She stays in Germany. The first time she said she was frightened was when the Soviet forces invaded Berlin because, you know, she'd heard about what they often did to women. But she claimed not to be frightened before that. And she was a very brave person. I mean, you know, she was brave and she was hiding Jews, which in itself I find unbelievable because she was one of them.
Well, she was hiding Jews with somebody very famous.
With somebody, if you know that history, I don't know how many of our listeners will know the name Christabel Bielenberg, but she was actually Anglo-Irish, but married to a German lawyer, non-Jewish lawyer called Peter Bielenberg. And Christabel was part of a sort of aristocratic set there. Adam von Trott and people like that were part of it. And that network helped to find places for Jews to hide. And Ilse became part of it, and Christabel Bielenberg, you know, in her memoir writes quite a lot about Ilse and the role she played. And she was extremely brave. I mean, she didn't need to do that. It was obviously risky. There came a point where there were terrible punishments for doing that, but she did. And yeah, so, you know, that was something she did right into the worst times. I mean, up 41, 42, 43. But she somehow wasn't disturbed. And she was also very savvy, you know, she knew how to work the system, you know, what to say if there was a knock on the door, you know, to leave plenty of crucifixes lying around. But I mean, that didn't help other people. So it's still to me a mystery how that helped. And it's above all a mystery to me psychologically how one could not be terrified.
So that's two of the sisters, and they're both extraordinary stories. And now we come to what I think is the most extraordinary of all, which is Aunt Ursel.
Yes. Well, I sort of very briefly, because it is so extraordinary, summarized it, you know, in my opening comment. I mean, Ursel also was the most intense in terms of refusing her Jewish ancestry. It was very distressing for me, very distressing for my mother, who was always very distressed by it. And to the point where when a building in Berlin that had been confiscated from my grandparents in 1938 as part of the so-called Aryanization of Jewish property, they had a shareholding in a Schmatter factory in Prenzlauer Berg in a beautiful building. And it was with a number of other cousins and relatives and friends and so on. And that was confiscated. And then after the wall fell in 1989, it was, the file was discovered and it was returned to us, returned to the three sisters. And Ursula refused to accept her inheritance. She refused any connection. I mean, she was beside herself about that. And it was very bizarre, because usually people take money, I mean, at the end of the day, they will take the money, but she didn't. And, that I found that extraordinarily powerful and distressing. But she was terribly traumatized by that time, and she'd spent these years in hiding from the time she was sacked in 1935, when they started to clear out German. I mean, you could somehow get by, especially if you were young and unknown. Sometimes you could get by until then. And she did, and she was in Bremen at the theater, performing classical roles, and then she was sacked, and then things got worse and worse, and she stayed and she was in hiding. And then through a fellow acting student, which is who I remember from my childhood, Jola Duisberg, I remember her very well. She was Austrian, and she was apparently very beautiful when she was young, and she married, in those days you often married very young. She was 90 when she married the inheritor, the heir to IG Farben, which was this huge German conglomerate that played a terrible role in the war effort, and it even owned a subsidiary that produced the Zyklon B, the gas. And but this son of the proprietor and president he wasn't in the business, but he was the heir, and he was actually in the theater as well. And he married this actress who was a friend of Ursula. And of course, they had access to the regime. And I know all the stories basically from them, but then I corroborated that through research in the German archives. And I found, the connection is exactly the case, that basically Jola Duisberg, who married this guy Duisberg was the name of the guy who ran IG Farben. They obviously, they went right to the top. I don't know whether they went to Goebbels himself, but they certainly went to Hinkel, because I found the correspondence. And Hinkel was the president of the Reichskulturkammer. I mean, the general secretary of the Reichskulturkammer. He was in charge of purging German culture of Jews. But for some reason or other, he helped my aunt by producing this Aryan certificate. Whether it was money, or whether he was attracted to her, or what it was, or whether he just wanted to do the Duisbergs a favor. But this was a very risky strategy. I mean, many Jews tried to become Aryan, and nearly all failed. I mean, I've seen the research. It's something like 90% failed. And if you were then, of course uncovered yourself precisely by applying. So, the penalty was the ultimate penalty for falsifying and so on.
She becomes an aristocrat.
So then she gets a certificate of Aryanization, and there's an incredibly moving letter in the German archives, which I reproduce in the book, which I discovered, which she never told me about. Maybe she'd forgotten about it, from her to Hinkel himself, in which she thanks him for giving her life back. She literally thanks him for giving her life back. And obviously she had been received by him, because she talks about her visit to him, and that she looked forward to seeing him again. So I just find it unbelievable that someone as senior as that actually not only helped, but received in his office a completely unknown young actress who'd only ever had one job, and who he knew had been in hiding. But everything happened. So yes, so she then gets a fake certificate of that she's an Aryan. which enables her to go back to the theatre in Bremen. She goes back to Bremen, she goes back to the same theatre, and she marries this aristocrat, quite a high-ranking aristocrat, but you know, she feels safe until one day, about 18 months later, she's walking home from the theatre after a performance, and somebody comes up to her in the street, as you say in German, by Nacht und Nebel. She never made out his face. It was a dramatic moment. He taps on the shoulder and he says, "We know who you are, really. We advise you to get out of the city immediately." So he must have been a nice guy, so to speak, because otherwise she just would have been arrested, and that's the end of it. And she took it obviously extremely seriously. And she went back to the theatre. She disguised herself. She found a wig and so on. Anyway, she disguised herself as a boy, as a young man, and she somehow went to Holland, where her husband, her new husband, was, of course, he was in the army. He had to be. And she said to him, "Look, this has happened." I don't know the details of how she tracked him down and of how she actually met him, because it was totally illegal, even for a non-Jewish wife, let alone for a Jewish one, to go to the front to your husband. But she did somehow, and she tracked him down. She said to him, "You have no choice, you have to desert the German army." Which from his point of view was, you know, obviously if you were discovered for that, that was a death sentence right there for the person who deserted. But he did desert. Apparently he agonized, that she always said, for 3 nights and 3 days. But then he acted, he deserted. And then the Dutch underground hid them until the end of the war. So, and then it's a long story. I don't know how much you want to hear, but basically he got arrested just before the end of the war, because he, of course, had deserted. So they learnt Dutch. You'd never utter a word of German, of course, so they learnt Dutch, but he was discovered on the street. I think he uttered 1 word of German, and he was arrested. And of course, she thought he suddenly didn't come home. She didn't leave. She didn't go out for what was it, for a year. She was hidden. So he went out to get food and bread and so on. And one day he didn't come back. So she assumed he'd been killed. But then they met up again after the war had ended. It turned out he'd been arrested. He'd been sent for court-martial to Germany. Germany was already losing the war in the Netherlands. So the courts, for officers, he was a young officer in the officer rank. And he was being tried, and it was just a miracle, because there was a fellow comrade of his from the war in Africa who basically told the judge, who was one of these Nazi hanging judges, "Look, this guy has basically just lost his mind. He's a great patriot," etc., etc. And his life was spared, or he would have been immediately executed, but his life was spared. And then they met up again sometime later. So yes, very dramatic stories.
Before, there's lots more to ask, of course, but before we throw this open to the audience, there's just a couple of sort of larger questions in a way, which I'd like to ask you. First, you ask in the book, how did they hide in plain sight? And you have a fascinating answer. They had the power of their own denial. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think that you can convince yourself of things to the degree where I suppose that's not a particularly original point to make. You can convince yourself of things to the point where you believe them. And they convinced themselves at times, that's the other thing that's so puzzling, that they just had nothing to do with the Jewish people. It's a painful thing was very painful for me and my brother, but you know, as I tried to say in my opening remarks, I just avoid judging, because I didn't live at that time and I didn't have to go through that. But I think that you can almost change the vibe you give. So for example, you know, Ilse would not have given off a vibe of fear. I mean, a lot of people were caught because you could, you know, the Nazi officer or whatever, or the policeman saw the look in their eyes of fear. But if you've convinced yourself you're someone other than you are, perhaps you don't have that reaction. And I mean, my family had denied their origins. I mean, my mother much less. She was just ambiguous. But there were times when she would say, "I'm not Jewish." And we would go, "Well, what are you talking about? How can you change your mind on this?" But, as I say, I avoid judgment on that because I didn't go through that. But I think that you can, in short, almost change your inner consciousness to believe you're something you're not. And I think that's what happened under this pressure.
And then at the end of the book, you say, "My return to Germany begins." And you put return in inverted commas. What is tell us about your return to Germany?
Well, I'm an absolute product of my family in the sense that I grew up in an intensely German Jewish environment. I mean, really, despite what I just said about denial, my mother and my father, I mean, my father never denied anything, but my parents, friends, and circle were almost exclusively that. And they almost didn't know how to really relate intimately to those who weren't from that background. So, of course, I absorbed that and I love it. And it's given me a huge amount, I mean, beginning with music, but, that can't be a coincidence that I love German philosophy, for example. I just gravitated towards it, not because I was trying to belong, but it just spoke to me. So, and German literature and poetry, it all speaks to me. So I have a great love for German culture. I've just totally inherited that. And I'm aware of the ironies and the absurdities, but I can't help it. And so I've always wanted to somehow, yes, in inverted commas, because I never left it. I was born in England. I always wanted to somehow return and live there, or at least live there half time. And I do feel very at home, despite everything. I have my eyes open. And in the book, I describe one horrible conversation in a cafe that I overheard in Berlin, anti-Semitic conversation. So I'm not deluded, I think. But, I have this great love for Germany, and I would like to, in some sense, return. And funnily enough, very few people in my position who are born in this background actually feel like that. So I know one person very well who I grew up with who has actually kind of returned to Berlin. And it moves me a lot that she's done that. And I haven't done that. For all my talking, I've never done it. But I want to do it. And, that's just how it is. I'm just programmed that way. That's my way.
Half each year in Berlin.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I'm squaring the circle at the moment. I mean, also, I have work to do here, so I can't disappear completely. But I have, yes, and I feel that it's part of a sort of historical justice. In a funny way, I feel that Hitler wanted to get rid of us all, and damn it, he's not going to have succeeded entirely. But I'm in a minority, and I'm aware of that. And I find it odd that I am in a minority, because those of us who grew up in that environment were given it so strongly. I mean, my parents, or my mother particularly, sort of always indoctrinated us. But, other families, I know so many of them, the atmosphere was just, I know this atmosphere. And even when they didn't indoctrinate their children, the atmosphere is there, and you grow up with that, and that's your heritage.
Well, there's lots more I'd love to ask you, but we're going to throw it open now. So I will hand you over to Susan, who will pass on the questions from the audience. Thank you, Simon.
Hi.
Thank you.
Right, lots of questions saying how fascinating. One of the things that's come out, which I must tell you, is there's a lady and her mother in the audience, and her mother was a friend of your mother's.
Oh my goodness.
She met you on holiday in Switzerland, and they actually have a video. You fell in a swimming pool, apparently.
Oh, well, I remember. Is this the Dansons?
It is the Dansons, and I'm going.
Oh my goodness, how unbelievable!
So I'm sure that's quite emotional. I've sort of thrown that at you, but what I will do is when we've finished, I will Jackie has given me her email, her permission to pass her email on, and they'd love to be in contact with
Amazing.
you. They weren't actually sure when they joined the presentation if that's who you were, and they were asking me questions from the very
I am, and I remember them very well.
Oh, okay, that's lovely.
Very well.
So,
I nicknamed Jackie Praline for some reason. I have no idea why.
So I will leave you to converse with them separately. But I thought that was lovely.
Goodness me, yes, that was an Adelborden at Max Rostal's festival, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But I might be wrong about that.
Okay, I've had quite a few comments about denying their Judaism, but I actually think you've covered that in such depth. One of the questions is, how do you identify now? Do you identify as
I'm very clear, very, very clear about that. I identify very clearly as Jewish, with a German origin, with a German inflection, unquestionably.
Okay.
I have more of a problematic identification with being British. I mean, there I just have this, and I feel terribly ungrateful because I know I wouldn't exist without Britain. And I'm not in any way, what's the word, hostile, goodness me, no. I feel tremendous gratitude like my parents did, unbelievable gratitude. But, you know, when you've, as I know others in my situation feel, when you've grown up in that environment, it's very difficult, even pre-Brexit, to feel completely at home.
Okay, but, I mean, I think that's something we hear from a lot of what we would call our second generation members.
I'm sure, absolutely.
That culture is so much a part of their upbringing, regardless of where they were living. Have you managed to explain to yourself your mother's wish to be buried in a Jewish cemetery?
Yes, I think, you know, that she, in the end, that was the deeper allegiance. And, you know, I mean, the need to, you know, I mean, death is, so to speak, eternal. And there's no need to conceal oneself or to, you know, my mother was, unlike her sisters, as I've said, was very much more ambivalent. I mean, she could go from one extreme to the other. She might say she's not Jewish, and then she would say she's passionately Jewish. And I never discovered the laws of nature that caused her to take any particular point of view. But she always said to me that she would only have married a Jew. I mean, a German Jew, which indeed she did. And, you know, so she had a very strong sense of identification.
Okay. I've sort of tried to condense some of the questions because, as I sort of said, a lot of people questioned how they sort of felt that they could completely hide their Judaism. I don't know if that's something you want to elaborate on at all. Now we've got a little bit of time.
I would love to elaborate on it. I find myself, you know, I get into, I mean, I can only elaborate by getting into psychobabble. I mean, because I don't personally understand how one can completely change one's consciousness, particularly when one's doing it only sometimes and not at other times. I mean, of course, we know that human beings can believe there are all kinds of things. I mean, there are human beings who believe that they're Jesus Christ or God or, you know, or whatever. I mean, people are capable of unbelievable self-delusion. And there are gradations of that where you can completely delude yourself, and yet you sometimes know you're deluding yourself. So it's very complicated. But I would just say that, you know, to me, the most powerful evidence of that is that Ursel and Ilse did not get caught. And they did not, Ilse in particular, never gave off this scent of somebody who was in danger. Ursel actually did. She had a lot of fear, and this was a huge issue. But Ilse is a miraculous case to me. I simply can't understand it. It's a kind of complete forgetting also of cultural memory. And in Ilse's case, it was really only at the end of her life. It's painful to talk about, but right at the end of her life, it all came out. And she was convinced, you know, I mean, this was obviously decades after the war was over. She was convinced the Gestapo would come after her and she was, you know, screaming. I mean, it was a terrible business. So obviously, you know, the repression in the end, due to old age and illness, didn't work anymore. But it worked quite astonishingly, including after the war. I mean, that's one of the things I find so extraordinary in my families. You know, when it was no longer needed, it just continued, as if the Third Reich had never been defeated somehow, as if that danger was always there or potentially there.
In fact, that's brought up the next comment, which I've had a few comments on chat, just general rather than a question, that people have been aware of that in their upbringing, this sort of fear to hide their background, even if their parents didn't totally deny their Judaism. And
Right.
that, you know, I've had a few comments in the chat, people from an Austrian Jewish family, and in a way, the person on here says it's completely fascinating, and they don't seem to get enough of hearing other people's stories. And I think that's very true. I'm sure you find that with other people you speak to, that you
Yes.
said you sort of recognize in your upbringing.
Oh God, oh totally. I mean, it is compulsively interesting. I'm often afraid that, you know, people will just find it boring because, you know, one goes on so much about it. And of course, nowadays, I mean, not just people from our background, but, you know, identity has become such an enormous issue for many reasons, but partly because we obviously do live in a more pluralistic world where you can actually choose your identity in a certain way. You know, just like you can now practically choose your gender. I mean, you know, so we've become so self-determined that this is an issue for almost everybody at this stage, and not just for people of our particular background.
I think I've sort of really, as per AJR, in our normal efficient way, we start on time and we finish on time. But David, I'll leave it to you to wrap up. Thank you everyone for joining us. I did put a link on to Simon's book, but if there's any other information anybody wants, by all means email me at AJR. I will be happy to pass emails on to Simon. I'm sure you'd like to hear people's feedback, or if they've got any
delighted to.
video. If you just email me at AJR, it's easy email address, susan@ajr.org.uk. Simon, thank you for joining us, and I will pass on those details to you, but I'll leave it to David to have the final word.
Susan, thank you so much, and thank you for fielding all the questions so admirably. And Simon, thank you very much. It is the most fascinating book. It's always tricky if you know someone and they say, "Oh, I've just written a book," and you think, "Oh, really? Okay." And then you read it, and it's absolutely, from page 1 to the end, it is absolutely full of twists and turns and extraordinary moments, and I do recommend it to everybody. It's published by Picador, and as Susan says, it's available through Amazon and all good local bookstores as well. And it's been
none of which are open.
Well, West End Books in West Hampstead is open, and Barnes Bookshop in Barnes is open, so who knows where else. But Simon, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, and
thank you very much, and thank the audience who are silent inevitably, but thank you all very much for coming and for your question.
Great, many thanks. Be well.
Bye.